right, here we go. I'm really excited for this one. We've been planning this one. It feels like months, it might be years, but I am here for those who don't know what the fuck they're watching. I am here with Cody, the director of Defense Distributed, which is sort of like, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding, sort of an umbrella organization. In fact, I'm just going to pull up the sorry, he just left here. Okay, wait, here we go. He is back. Here we go. Um, I'm just teeing up the website here, showing people Defense Distributed is the main site, also affiliated with DefCAD, Ghost Gunner, and Legio. So this is, to my mind, the definitive resource hub for everything to do with 3D printed guns or guns that are manufactured independently in a variety of different ways, which we'll get into. So, first of all, Cody, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. That is some nice ambiance in the background. That's something I'd like to get. I'm trying to get this podcast out in the bush myself.
Is it too loud?
No, it's good. I'm unironically saying that that's a cool vibe that's brought to this. I like it.
Nice white people neighborhood.
There's something weird about my neighborhood because I live in a nice, quiet neighborhood, but I don't get the crickets, and I only noticed that recently, and it's bothering the hell out of me right now.
It's like without something, there's no silence. Silence itself is too loud. I think I understand.
Yeah, it's like I'm just living in the fucking back rooms. And there was this kid in my neighborhood. I don't know. There was like a kid that would wander around at night just by himself. And me and my wife called him Night Child. And we just saw him the other day because we didn't see him for months. And I'm like, man, what happened to Night Child? He just receded back into the shadows. And there he is again. This place fucking sucks. I'll tell you that right now. Anyway, what we're here to talk about? We're talking about self-defense mastery in an independent context. So I thought to tee this up. This is a big story. And me and Defense Distributed Cody and others have been going back and forth for a while. I'm pretty knowledgeable. I'm hip to the whole story here, but I was wondering if we can kind of just explain to people as briefly as you want what Defense Distributed is, how we got from where it started to here, and most importantly, I think the labyrinth of legal battles that you've had to deal with to really be the figurehead of this movement, and that's how I would describe it.
Sure, yeah. So DD is like a lot of the groups forming right now on the internet, just nothing. A couple of friends get together and they say, hey, let's 3D print a gun. Now, we're inspired, this is 10 years ago, so we're inspired by Julian Assange, WikiLeaks. We don't really have any other analogs. And our politics are, there's no such thing as even the alt-right yet. So it's really just cynical about the future of the Second Amendment as interpreted or defended by the Supreme Court. And its mission brief is simply that, well, there's not going to be anything like a defense contractor for the public in terms of open source unless we just do it and say it that way. So we organize just as a way to begin to disclose technical data for firearms into the public domain, because we recognize a kind of loophole in the arms export laws. And really that is the tripwire for the next 10 years of litigation. It's all about arms export law. And then there's some supplementary state laws that begin to get made. And we see them getting made all the time now, especially after this shooting in New York City. So that's the opening.
Yeah, and we'll get to that shooting in a little bit too, because that's going to be very, very important. And just so people know what they're looking at, if you're just listening to the audio right now, we're looking at DefCAD right now. You see some examples of the types of guns we're talking about. Some people, they hear I saw a film, not a terribly good one, last night. It was okay, called Carry On with Jason Bateman. And a 3D printed gun factored pretty heavily into that film, but it looked really cartoonish. It looked like a toy gun. And I think that's what people imagine when they think of a 3D printed gun. But if you don't know look at the stuff we're talking about right here on DefCAD. This is some pretty serious hardware. I'm looking at a Gatling gun right now with 412 downloads. It's interesting stuff. And so I guess to start, it's that would you say that the technology has significantly evolved over the how many years have you been working on this project?
Well, in one form or another, sure. It's been maybe 12 years. And what, of course, the technologies involved have all progressed, but those technologies are larger and larger. What basket ensemble? So we begin with 3D printing, and some people in our culture define this activity as only 3D printing, as only what you can do on a 3D printer. But of course, very quickly we begin to find commercial exploitation of this family of technologies in techniques like CNC printing. I'm sorry, CNC milling. So there's just lots of ways to do, you know, DIY gunsmithing or home gunsmithing, and maybe two main families of technologies. But then there's even more. I mean, people have discovered basically ECM rifling of barrels. People are working on DIY ammunition, and now, of course, there's the drone conversation, launchers, 37 millimeter, and other types of launchers. So this is a growing family of activity.
Yeah, that's one thing that as I was getting deeper into your offerings and the projects that you're working on, on the screen right now, I've pulled up the Coast Gunner 3S, which is, I would describe it to people as a hobbyist milling machine. But if you know anything about CNC machines, my co-host does, Judas. He's really into the stuff. He works in manufacturing, and he was really impressed by outside of the applications for weaponry, you could use this hypothetically to mill all kinds of shit. And what you had just said is like, yeah, sure, the applications for defense are important, but these really are, to my mind, wondrous pieces of technology, because you have the 3D printing, and people just hear that and they think, oh, plastic. But you combine that with, you have these two machines that can do two separate things, and now it's the, you know, the synthetic material, but then just straight up metal as well. And then I don't know, that to me is far more. The applications are endless there.
I agree, but there's also this kind of combination of everything refeeds back into itself, and so the dominant practice in, let's say, 3D printed guns right now is a hybrid practice where, okay, like the shooter in New York City, he's credited with having a 3D printed gun, but what does that really mean? It means he printed the frame, right? He didn't print the entire gun. He didn't print the barrel. He didn't print the slide. He might have printed his silencer, his suppressor, which is really interesting. But this is a hybrid activity. So in the intervening years, especially since like 2018, 2019, since like 3D printed guns kicked off, people have discovered that the most success, both commercially, practically, artistically, is in, you know, taking what you can from, you know, historical like kit guns or surplus kits, printing the parts that might or might not be regulated, might or not be commercial. Um, so there's just this kind of Frankenstein approach, and it's working.
Well, I'd love to hear you speak to that a bit more, because again, me as the dummy who doesn't know too much about this stuff, what do you see the most of? And we can go back to the DefCAD site here. Do you see more people completely printing entire guns, or is it more just parts? And how popular is the Frankenstein approach?
Well, you know, we measure popularity. You know, we probably have the best insight on what's popular because we run DefCAD, that site you have there. And DefCAD is a way of understanding what people are downloading, what is popular, when it's popular. So you see certain phases where, let's say, you know, 2019, 2020, Glock frames were the hot new thing to print, and that represented something of a breakthrough because Gen 3 Glock parts exist everywhere, and there's kind of this enormous aftermarket in those types of components. And where now you may see there's more differentiation of commercial, quasi-commercial design groups and designers who are platformed and producing commercial kits. You get a sense of like these aren't really that, the numbers don't rise up to what you would see here with printing Glocks or printing Glock frames. So there's different types of activity, and I can anchor this or index this to other people in our space or near our space. Like polymer 80 became very popular in the United States, so popular that the federal government decided to regulate. Joe Biden's ATF decided to create a rule to make illegal the types of kits that polymer 80 was selling. And these are Glock kits. And so, you know, some of the evolution here tracks with people's appetites. So people wanted Glocks with no serial numbers. Okay, there were kit versions of that they could buy in the mail. They didn't need to print the frame, but then that became illegal, and so actually that became much more popular to print them, and we begin to see this in the data of who's downloading what. I mean, I could spend a million years here, but there's lots of different areas, little hotspots of activity now where people want to print AR receivers because ARs are very popular in the United States. People want to print Glock frames, and then there's this whole other realm of activity and a line of activity, you could say, that has a view to the international conversation,
Now,
which is the FGC9.
I'd love to hear a bit more about the sort of trends you've noticed in this space. Just because you could go on for a while about that, but I also wanted to know um, how fast does the law respond to this? You just mentioned the Biden administration was cracking down on this one specific kit. Do you find that they're quick to act when they get wind of something, or do the wheels of the legal system move slowly?
Is my reception still good?
Oh yeah, you sound good.
Okay. You know, I saw a rule at one point, maybe like a rule of thumb. This was in 2017, and it said something like, "Okay, the federal government is about 5 years behind whatever neat trick you think you have, whatever new product you think you're gonna." And in general, I found that's true. You've got to do something fun and cool. That certainly was the case with us with Liberator, the first 3D printed gun, and then with the new class of products like with Polymer 80, which really started getting traction in 2018, 2019. Those things were illegal by 23. And so that's kind of held in my experience. At the same time, there's certain things they want to make illegal, and they know they can't.
What would some of the things that they want to make illegal but they can't? What would those be? Would those just be individual parts?
No, in the United States, I mean, look, what side it's in Canada, right? You're in Canada.
That's right.
Am I allowed to say that? Have I outed
Yeah,
you?
yeah. People know well because also for people who don't know, a lot of our American friends don't know that guns are very popular in Canada. There's a lot of gun owners up here, a lot of semi-auto rifle fans, and I do believe there's a pretty sizable community of people who are very vocal about their rights and interested in stuff like this. And there are, markets for this sort of thing.
I guess I asked that simply to say, I'm giving my answers with this kind of default point of view of, what is the American appetite, what's the American market, and then therefore what's the American government trying to do, U.S. government. But there are different answers here, and now a bunch of governments are all in the kind of next phase of their response to 3D guns because of the shooting in New York, among other reasons. So I'm happy to answer, in a kind of different case, or for a different audience. You just tell me.
What's interesting is that in Canada, we don't have any stories, as far as I'm concerned, like the recent shooting of the health insurance CEO. So I think a lot of the legislators and politicians up here are just responding to how scary the phrase ghost gun is. Like, that's a scary thing you should make illegal. And also just taking its cues from America. So it's something that I think they see as easy to crack down on because there aren't as many vocal people. And as much as firearms are popular up here, they're not as legally protected here as in America. It's by the fucking grace of God that they're not snatched up. The what we have going for us up here is that the federal government's actually kind of disorganized. It's very bureaucratic, but it's very spread thin and internally weak. So it can't really marshal its forces to do heavy crackdowns on fucking anything. It can try, or it can offer gun buybacks, but then no one offers, and then they're just stuck. Right. That's
Well,
kind
I
of where
mean,
we're
you
at right now.
you say that, but I just read what 2 nights ago or last week that a whole bunch of new guns are scheduled on some kind of ban list that you guys have.
It depends where you are. Like in Ontario, Ontario would be what would the analogous be? Big New York State. So like it's very difficult to get a gun in Toronto. Not as hard as the UK, not as hard as London, but I remember a few years ago, like they banned the AR-15, literally just as a gesture, just because they're scared of that in the U.S. So let's ban it up here. They can do that. They did that in Ontario, but then there's sort of analogous semi-auto rifles that people can get. So we can't really do anything when the government decides to crack down is the
Yeah,
issue. We don't
yeah.
have any legal recourse like the Second Amendment. However, they might just be so confused and like the fucking Liberal Party right now is falling apart, our prime minister might get fired. So like there's enough
Yeah, yeah.
chaos that stuff like this kind of slips
I
through.
I saw that, but at the same time, the Liberal Party just added 300 something guns by name to some kind of ban list that you guys have, and then there's this C-21 or whatever that is, where you cannot sell even the guns that you can possess. You can't transfer. So it sounds like a fucking nightmare. And then when you told me, oh, there's not that many stories up here, I can see how in Canadian experience there don't seem to be that many stories. But every time something happens in Canada, someone tells me about it, especially your media. So I am acutely aware of ghost gunner machines ending up in Canadian, possession, and whenever there's like drug busts and stuff, whenever there are 3D printed guns captured. So there is, especially now with the government in disarray and more of these guns banned, it seems to me there's never been more of an appetite for Canadian 3D printed or otherwise digitally made guns.
Yeah, and I think the market for guns is different up here. And my co-host Judas, he's a big fan of going to auctions and buying, kind of guns that need repairs and doing the repairs himself. And there's more of a culture of that up here. But if you want to, it's a bit harder to get guns. It's a bit harder to trade guns. And everything's just fucking spread out up here is the problem. Like it takes forever to drive anywhere. So that's why I thought that this maker revolution, whatever you want to call it, the idea that people can start doing the stuff themselves, that is uniquely attractive, I think, to a Canadian who in every other aspect of their lives usually have to do things for themselves because just the market for everything isn't as flush with product as it is in the US.
Sure, yeah. And it's also a feature of our export laws, at least at the moment, that it's much easier to get this stuff into Canada. You're allowed to export this stuff to Canada, even in like the most, in context that you would imagine to be otherwise really restricted. Canada's considered kind of an exception.
And that's interesting. And now we're getting into what I really wanted to get into, which was the legal. I would count you as the expert of the legality around this entire thing. You've been at war legally in many different aspects, and these are documented on the sites that every time you've won in court or been taken to court. And I was wondering if you'd like to give just a short story arc of all the shit you've had to deal with up to and including the recent one involving you, I believe, taking GoFundMe to court.
Yeah, we're suing Kickstarter, if you know that, Kickstarter.com.
Yep.
Suing Kickstarter. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's what it is to be first. You're going to catch the arrows, they say, like the pioneer gets the arrows. So, okay, we put the first few gun files on the internet, and Obama's national security staff basically direct him 2 or 3 different ways to get it off the internet. He's also pressured, by the way, by other governments. Obama, I mean, Australia and Canada are high on this list, it turns out. You can see this in the record. And so there's this strong pressure to say, well, there has to be some national security reason to get this off the internet. We can't just let anyone download it. But there's this problem where you at least have to pay lip service to the American Second Amendment, which had become kind of accidentally a universal entitlement in the United States law. So they have to do this little dance where they go, well, of course Americans can have it, but you see there's certain problems if there's political military problems if we just put it on the internet unrestricted. And so that's the first leg of the real litigation that we have to be a part of. So we give Liberator away, right? It's open source because the philosophy, the technique is all about being open source. That's one way to beat the law. But then the law tries to beat you back. So you go to court, which is a very expensive thing, federal court, because you gave something away. So then you have to commercialize. You have to find a way. Because look, no one's just going to give you the money. Yeah, you can kind of bet on getting Elon Musk to give you some funds or something, but chasing whales ends up being your full-time job if you do that. So we wanted to supplement what we did with commercial activity to fund suing the United States government. So that's what we ended up doing. In 2015, we brought our first lawsuit against the U.S. State Department, which had told us to take down DevCat, that site that you had up earlier. There's been different versions of this website. And DevCat we mostly hosted because all these other websites began to take 3D printed gun content off. There were early repos like Thingiverse, which is still around. And all these people began to discover a progressive policy to not allow gun files. So the other technique here is there's the soft power side and the hard power side where sure anyone in America is allowed to do this, but you'll quickly find out that no platform will take it, no bank will fund it, no one will allow transactions around it. And then if you still insist on doing it, the government finds a reason to demand that you take it down anyway. Those are my first sets of lessons from like 2013 to 2015.
They'll try and bring the law against you, and failing that, they will create a law at some point.
Yeah. But then again, there's the formal and the informal. I'm sorry, it's a little noisy out here in this neighborhood. But,
No, this sounds great.
So the informal is, well, of course, right? Anyone can do this, and that's fine. But right, there's this like latent implicit threat, the but, So we encounter that threat over and over again, and then finally you realize, well, this is a kind of social red line, and once that social red line is crossed, many things are allowed to happen to you, like this Mark Andreessen quote, or this clip is going around where he's on Joe Rogan, and it's kind of a revelation to some people, even in my own social circle, that, whoa, did you hear this? They're like banning CEOs from like having bank accounts in the United States, and of course, if you're a Canadian trucker, you know what we're talking about, and if you're a little too active during COVID, suspicious about the vaccine, you know what we're talking about. But we started experiencing that in 2014, 2015, because we were trying to have bank accounts related to 3D printed guns.
I wonder, now that it seems that tech CEOs are talking about it on Joe Rogan, are you finding that you're experiencing more public support, or do you think that the technocrats might take a more of a keen interest in what you're up to?
Man, this goes in stages, and you can also measure it against what's happening to Alex Jones at any given time. But let's do the fast forward thing on the litigation. We take the State Department to court, and kind of against all odds, I mean, we don't win, we don't out and out win. And in fact, the Supreme Court refuses to take the case. But then Trump, right when it really looks like I'm losing, Obama leaves and Trump wins the government over here. And then there's this incentive at Maine Justice to settle this case because they're not a gun control win doesn't look good for the administration. So they direct basically us to settle. Okay, then when we settle, we get this odd decision, which corresponds with a reform that was already happening in export law. And then Trump doesn't want to be guilty of being the guy to approve it. So space between governments where we get the settlement, we're sitting on it for like months. And then finally in 2018, we're allowed to put the files back up on the internet officially. And when we do that, when we are officially allowed to put the files back up on the internet, by like states in the United States, federal system. So like this, but we also get banned on Facebook, banned on Instagram, banned on Twitter, and simultaneously insert as a response to the settlement, decide, okay, we're gonna real-time filter links to this website. We're gonna not allow people to share this stuff, even in private messages and DMs. And this was shocking to me at that time. Seeing much more of that, especially after COVID.
Yeah, that's wild. So yeah, you were one of the first people to be debanked and experience that coordinated soft power. Like you had mentioned, things seemed to change when Trump won the first time. Did they shift again under Biden? Is it just, does the tone change every time power changes hands? I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because, okay, for example, we take, Biden brings his rule out and we fight it the whole time. We fight it in the APA process. We do there's this notice and comment thing you got to do in the administrative law in the United States. So before you get a rule, quote unquote, which is how the administrative state actually controls the country and how powers actually exercise in this country, Congress just kind of waves its hands and says, federal agency, you figure it out. You know what we mean. And then the agencies come up with these rules. So Biden directed his ATF to come up with a rule to really conquer and assign and require the assignment of serial numbers to unfinished components, made components, printed components, and kind of encapsulate all activity in the official, gunsmithing terminology, legal, I don't know, the legal tables of how guns and gunsmithing is done as regulated by the ATF. That's the short story. Anyway, we fought that rule through the APA process. And then when it finally became a rule, we had to fight with one hand behind our back. And I mean that I mean that more than figuratively, because we had to basically offer half of our product offerings going forward, because that was the tricky part of this rule. This rule says, well, you could basically only choose fixtures versus receivers. You can't sell both anymore. You can sell equipment or you can sell the unfinished thing. But if you sell both, now you're regulated, and you got to go to jail if you do it. So we had to have our product offerings. Different states passed copycat versions of Biden's rule at the same time, because the states like to copy this stuff. What I mean is Democrat states that are aligned with the Democrat administration. So all this happens from 22, 21, 22, 23, to where we're greatly diminished in our commercial power. And then we take this rule to court, to a federal court in Texas, and we win all the way. We get nationwide injunctions, and we have a bunch of co-plaintiffs. We go all the way to Supreme Court. And in October of this year, I was just so of our experience here. It's like we're not really going to win that case again. And again, he's not supposed to win. And you can feel the entire the air let out of the room. Okay, you already want to win anymore. And since 2017, where pace again, even though we lost the whole time,
Well, that's fascinating. I do want to say that your voice is starting to crack and go robot a little bit there. So I don't know if you can it's not unlistenable. It's just popping in and out. But if you're heading into a worse reception area, you might want to turn around. And I wondered if we can skip ahead in that. Oh, he went away. He is back. Here we go. There he is. I wanted to know if we could skip ahead to the legal issues you're having with Kickstarter. And this is all, as far as I can tell, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is surrounding, if we can, I'm going to go right here, I should put it on screen, the not the Coast Gunner, but the device known as the Coast Runner. Or not the Ghost Gunner, but the Coast Runner is a similar rebranded, repackaged product. And I believe, from my personal story, was I saw the crowdfunding campaign for this, and within a day, it gotten up to 6 figures, and it was on a rocket ship to make millions. There was clearly a demand for this thing. People thought it was just a cool thing to invest in, and then it was taken down. Is that about how it happened?
Sure, that's the outside looking in. But we just filed a lawsuit in, I guess, Midland, Odessa, Western District of Texas, about all the stuff behind the scenes on that one. And so Coast Runner is a totally different company. It's a separate machine. It's built differently than the Ghost Gunner on purpose. It's built to be a different machine, a general purpose machine, because, like you mentioned at the beginning of this talk, what have you built when you've built equipment and technology that can build gun parts? You've built equipment that can do anything else, everything else. Because if you can build gun parts, you can build basically anything else. And so we're shopping that technology in a new format with a new company to a new audience, and we get buy-in from these crowdfunding sites. I mean Kickstarter.com, and I mean Indiegogo.com. And what's funny is, behind the scenes, this is all very well oiled. And I guess I use the word choreographed. It is like that for these bigger projects. And when you see something like a new 3D printer launched on Kickstarter, it's no accident. It's not like someone just decided to do that a week before. They've cleared it with Kickstarter. They've kind of got some runway laid out for them, and some red carpet laid down, and there's agreements. And anyway, all these same things happened for us. And so it was strange. It was strange that they allowed us to get so far to raise the money. I mean, this is months and months of planning and ads, pre-launch ads for reservations and stuff. Okay, we finally launched. We get $500,000 the first day. And then Kickstarter decides it has a problem. And so I would love to know the true story of what those conversations were. And I have enough information that those conversations happen that it allows me to survive in court and find out. And again, this is a way of taking the experience of the hard and soft power that we discussed earlier, this kind of social program, and and getting a hook in the judicial system and being allowed to explore, being allowed to understand how the censorship industrial complex actually works, at least in the United States.
Is there anything you've learned so far that you'd be willing to disclose based on just your involvement in this specific case? Like you said, we have it up on screen right now so people can see. This is the Coast Runner website. It's been in the LA Times, TechCrunch, Freethink. Like you look at this and it's like, oh, here's just a good machine that can machine steel, aluminum, brass, anything. The examples of what it can make are wide and varied. So it must have been a coordinated attack. And is there any? You talked about conversations you're privy to. Is there anything you can kind of give us about what might be going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, and we pled a lot of it in the complaint. So there are companies that only work with Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and we were working with these companies. And those companies basically they have this, I won't say parasitic, but they have this kind of, they live only in the ecosystem that Kickstarter provides and only work with those groups and professionals. And so they were kind of conveying to us all of the decision making up until our launch, after our launch. We go to CES every year. We took Coast Runner to CES, for example, and we have all these private dinners with these executives, and it's very strange to know that there was all this approval until suddenly there wasn't. It just is unbelievable. And so we think government's involved.
And do you think it's the American government, or you had mentioned before that there's sort of a coordinated effort with Canada, with Australia? Is this sort of like is it like an international pressure bearing down on you, or is it really just America?
Well, I think there's a civic religion in the United States, and it's not hard to enforce that civic religion. So perhaps if push comes to shove, things can always get escalated to a corporate executive who and appropriately enforces the civic religion. So this could have just been that we stayed at a low enough level with low enough level executives to where there wasn't a problem until a bigger external power steps in and says, "Hey, what the fuck is going on here?" Okay, so it could have been like that, or go ahead.
I was going to say, you had mentioned also before that you experienced the most pushback with democratic governments. You seem to be doing better under Trump. Do you see it broadly that Republicans are better, or are conservatives also kind of spooked and wary about this thing?
If you have to choose between red team, blue team, red team's better on the gun issue. There's no question, but red team's hard. They're the legacy of like cold warriors in this country, in the national security state, and really what's left of that supposed Cold War garrison state. That's all Republican doing. And when you get into like the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, a very friendly place for this issue. If the issue is framed in terms of national security, by the State Department or the Commerce Department, even the rock-ribbed conservatives favor the government's position. So, I would 9 times out of 10 take a Republican, but a Republican doesn't get you very far, and it doesn't mean as much as you think it does. It means a Reagan appointee, a Nixon appointee. you never know what you're getting.
It's interesting because the problem is that you can craft whatever narrative you want, and I can imagine one that would get the conservatives, Republicans on board, which is that, okay, for example, there's the guy who shot the health insurance CEO. Well, there looks to be kind of maybe a right wing adjacent internet guy, European lineage, so that's one of our guys. However, if you wanted to get the Republicans involved, say, oh, you know what, this is something cartels are into. Cartels really like ghost guns. Boom, done. They want to get it taken out. Like it's not enough to bring up Islamists anymore. That's over. However, their hair trigger thing's going to be anything cartel related, anything mass migration. Then they will be as fervent as the Democrats, if not more so.
In general, I think that's true. I think state politics play a role. Like a Republican in New Jersey is never going to come along with you in the same way a Republican in Florida would, or obviously Texas. So, East Coast Republicans are kind of embarrassed by the ghost gun issue. They throw up some token resistance when the state laws are debated, and in general, they know they're outnumbered. They don't want to lose their credibility. That's what I have seen. And so there are ghost gun laws like in Rhode Island, Delaware, other places, which received basically nothing in terms of opposition. So it just depends on your constituency, and then it's easy to get up on a national platform if the politics are right and say like, well, this is an American tradition. You know, people have been making guns their whole for the history of the country, and I agree with that. But I watched a Republican attorney debate this in front of the Supreme Court, and Judge Roberts goes, "Okay, counsel, but you know, like, why are people doing this? Why would someone want to make a gun from a kit at home?" And
Yeah.
even the Republican attorney was like, kind of embarrassed to answer the question. It just shows their bad conscience, I think.
Yeah, and one thing that sprang to mind there, and I made a claim on an earlier episode, and I leave this to you to call bullshit on me, but when I think of the prototypical person who would employ a ghost gun of any kind or be into this at all, it's probably a white guy. It's not obvious to me that MS-13 or the fucking Crips or any of them are really into starting these machine shops. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's not obvious to me that there's a rash of ghost gun related homicides. I think they're just using regular guns for that stuff, and so it's, a lot of the fear has to be ginned up from very limited cases. Now, you are the expert, obviously, on all of the news. Is that accurate at all?
You know, I think what lends me expertise here is just having been as big a part of the commercial side of it as I've been, and having been a partner with companies like Polymer 80, where I could see where some of this stuff is going. And you've got a problem. You do have a demographic problem with some of these things, like the Polymer 80 kit, for example. That's a different class of customer. That's a cheap kit. It doesn't require a 3D printer. It doesn't require a CNC mill or really any kind of know-how. And so you are getting, Gangland really enjoyed the Polymer 80 kit. Okay, so think of Baltimore, think of Oakland, California. It's not really an exaggeration. And you would get on these subreddits and you would see like, oh hell, people are barely speaking English, just trying to like figure out how to put these guns together. That is happening. And then there are particular, let's say, ethno-psychological approaches to 3D printed guns, like the Glock switch. The Glock switch is very popular in Houston, Texas, for example, which turns a Glock to an automatic. So, there are different American gun cultures, and there is a black and urban American gun culture, which has its own, a distinct settlement with the laws and the municipal powers. And so it is hard to say and speak broadly about just one trend.
Can I ask you a question? This is an open-ended question, but
Uh-huh.
is there any region of America that, looking at the data and analytics of what's popular where, anything that you've been surprised by just looking at the numbers?
Well, over the years, it seemed that I had made most of the impact and most of the customer base. It was in California. And that always surprised me because I thought Californians were kind of overregulated. And in fact, that, I don't know, having 20 extra years of gun regulation, but I don't know, 30, 40 extra years of like a higher discretionary income, had created a kind of early adopter customer, or a customer who was much more comfortable with difficult or hard to understand, like the legal gray areas for guns. There's a California persona who is comfortable experimenting with new gun related stuff, where a lot of people who you think were in good states for guns are still kind of scared to jump in these frontier spaces.
Well, that's interesting. So the areas with the most relaxed gun regulations might be the last to adopt something like this. I guess that logically tracks as well. And you had mentioned, going on these subreddits and seeing people exchanging this information. Is there anything you've learned on an international market for this stuff? Now, does DefCat reach outside of America significantly? Is there any interest throughout Europe, Asia? What are the boundaries there?
Sure, yeah. There have been different versions of DefCat over the years, like I mentioned. And we had always seen like, well, who are the top 5? Who are the top 10 in terms of countries? And of course, it's always the US far and away. And then Europe's always playing catch up in terms of censoring the websites. So that composition has changed over the years. But in 2013, 2014, Germany is always following closely US culture. So it's always kind of in the top 3 of downloads and interests, which I find interesting. I found Spain to be overrepresented in early 3D printed guns. And maybe that makes sense because of, Catalonia and the kind of separatist anarchist cultures there. Maybe. I don't know how to tell that story.
Hmm.
And then, these days, well, I guess it's worth pointing out that JSark, for example, lived in Germany. JSark is probably the most famous developer of second-gen 3D printed guns. It's worth pointing that out. And then there's states that are especially scared of 3D printed guns, like the UK and Australia, Commonwealth states, former Anglo land, which I find ironic because, of course, American gun culture is simply a child of English gun culture.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I suppose that can just lead us into the most journalistically relevant part of this, which is the what was it, Luigi Mangione's recent I called it an assassination. Some people might disagree, but assassination of the United Healthcare CEO. And the story that I'm hearing is that it's confirmed it was a 3D printed gun. And I was just wondering, since we really started talking in earnest about scheduling this as quickly to that event as possible, you hear a news story like that. What goes through your head? Are you watching the video? You're trying to see where it came from. What's your response to this?
Every time there's a shooting in this country, and there was just another school shooting, right? There's like a trans shooter that shot up a Christian school.
There's been like a couple in the past week, unless I'm miscounting. I think there's at least two.
Well, when there is one shooting of note, the media will hyperfocus and amplify other shootings, which normally might not even make the national news. So that's in effect. But that trans shooting was pretty interesting. Okay, nevertheless, when there are events like this, and I've had years to have some practice here. For example, I launched a product the same day that, what's his face, the Paddock did that Las Vegas shooting, which is still the biggest mass shooting in the United States.
That everyone kind of forgot about. We bring it up every 6 months, like, yeah, whatever happened there? Anyway,
it's the most uncomfortable topic of conversation. Yeah, but okay, when something like that happens, first thing you do is you get the name, you run the name, because we have 2 or 3 large brands, right? You want to see if there's a customer profile or a purchase history with a name or a close match to the name. Okay, and then you're looking for the gun. And there are things like Coulter's law and stuff, right? The longer it takes for you to hear about the gun or the shooter, okay, the more you can begin to suspect that it wasn't something you should be worried about, because the media has like these perverse incentives to very quickly label a shooter white, very quickly label a gun an AR-15, to satisfy its power process. So we look for those things. What type of gun was it? We don't often think it's a 3D printed gun first because it's uncommon. And so that's what happened in the Mangione thing. We ran the name as soon as we had the name, but we spent that weekend not really thinking it was a 3D printed gun. And most people just had a kind of autistic, like flame wars about, well, was he not using a Nielsen device in his silencer? What kind of gun was it? Oh, it was a well rod. Everyone like satisfying their egos over like being a kind of expert about being able to identify the gun. No one called it as a 3D printed gun, and that was a big surprise, and for us too. So I had to rely on the media for accurate photos to actually identify the gun. And then I was surprised by what the gun that we saw.
yeah, and so I don't know too much about that gun. From what I know, a silencer was employed. And what do we know if it was a hybrid, as you said, or what's your assessment of? Because I heard some people laughing that he was using a silencer to begin with, because everyone's a fucking armchair assassin, right? Everyone says how they would do it, right? I
Yeah.
had said, I'm like, well, if it was me, I'd probably use a silencer because I played a lot of Hitman games, and that's what you do, and it kind of looks cool. But like, what's your assessment of his choice? Do you think he was, does he seem like, first of all, was it a 3D printed gun? Was it a hybrid gun? And do you think this was the type of guy who was just really into the scene, or what's your assessment there?
Really hard to know. And I've gone through some of the other communities to look for his name and the names that we saw on his fake IDs. As far as anyone knows, there's no profile that we can really attach to this guy that was out. So he was lurking if he was doing anything. But the choice of frame, you say, is it a hybrid gun? I mean, he printed a stipple remix of a kind of legacy printed Glock frame. Definitely not the newest stuff out there. And that's an interesting choice. It gave people a lot of pause. Like, what does this mean? Does it mean he printed this thing in 21 and just kind of got back around to it when he decided to kill a guy? You know, does it mean he just took a snapshot of 3D printed gun culture and downloaded some stuff in 21, 22, and then never really kind of updated himself? It's hard to say. And then you get a picture of his psychological profile where it seems that he's just kind of lost his mind in the last like 3 to 6 months.
So it's interesting. It's unlikely that he would have 3D printed this recently. In one way or another, it would have had to have been a few years ago.
Well, no, even that assessment's complicated because, like you mentioned, he uses a printed suppressor. And printed suppressors have only, especially of the kind that you can ID in that video, those have only been around for like a year or two. So, you know, like, that's a weird mix to me. It meant he might have come back and printed the suppressor more recently. I mean, he would have had to if he printed anything at all.
Do you think it's likely that he could have just bought it from someone? And I guess that's a very, very vague question asked. Is it more likely that someone would print it themselves versus buy it? But does he seem like the type of guy who would buy it? Does he seem like a guy who would have connections to other printers versus just maybe an autistic guy who just wanted to do it himself? Maybe these are unknowable questions, but I'm sure they've crossed your mind.
Sure, I think they've crossed everyone's mind in this space, and where we find a difference of opinion, I think, is where you find the difference about, well, was this even his idea? Like, okay, if you accept that he's an engineer and has a background in computer science, then it would kind of make sense that he dabbled in 3D printed guns. But should we accept that? And does this smell of some kind of operation? Like, is this a fall guy? I really genuinely don't know how to answer those questions.
I do want to give credit to a member of my chat, our community, named Prater Piper. He's a huge gun advocate. I believe he trains in firearms, and he was one of the first ones who forwarded the idea that something was off about this. The way he was using the gun was off. The way something to do with one of the rounds got caught or something, and the speed at which he did it. So I can't speak to that, but he was one of the ones who had said, something's off about this, and I said, I don't know about that. Like, maybe, but I'm open to hearing that reopened if the gun itself is kind of puzzling as well.
There's at least enough about the gun, the combination of parts, to ask, okay, but why that way? And all right, this is a broken guy. Okay, fine. He just wanted to print a gun to show he printed a gun. And if you accept his manifesto, I don't know if you read his little slip of paper. We've republished it at DefCat. You could find it if you search Mangione. But if you accept what's written there as his authorship, he says it was pretty simple. It just took a little bit of CAD. Okay, so he's saying he did it. But, by CAD, he's not saying he designed it. So what is he saying? Okay, I used a model viewer. I found something that I fancied, and I printed it on a bamboo printer. I mean, that doesn't take much at all. Why even claim credit for it that way? It's almost as if it's a setup to villainize 3D printed guns, among other things.
Yeah, it does. It crosses your mind that if you were going to do this, you would not want heat to blow back on the larger community, because if there's the number one issue with the community would be, we don't want to be associated directly with things like this. Is that a popular sentiment in the broader community? Like, you don't want to be seen endorsing acts like this?
Overtly it is, rhetorically it is, and yet there was an immediate celebration on Twitter. Guncat on Twitter, it's not so circumspect, and so it immediately was like, oh, this is one of our guns, amazing. This is we got it, we did it, fam. Our first high profile assassination. And that's funny, like, at first. And even the designer of the frame was like, oh, yo, this is mine, LOL. And then, he thinks about it after an hour, and he's like, oh, I'm going to ruin my life if I actually say that. So he deletes his tweet. And then when the New York Times and all these people reach out to him, he's begging for mercy. He's like, well, listen, you got to know, I didn't design this thing.
Well, they got to, LOL can mean a lot of things contextually.
Yeah, well, it doesn't mean anything good, and you're a giant idiot if you're just retweeting the Associated Press and being like, "It me."
Look, it costs you nothing just to say no comment. It does. It only hurts you if you're like celebrating it to everyone immediately, right?
Right, and I saw both. I saw even the guy who designed the suppressor, the guy we all believe designed the suppressor. He didn't really get name checked hard in the media, but at first he's like, "Haha, this is funny." and then he deletes his account. You know, and I don't know if you followed. You know about Radfem Hitler deleting her account because of the trans shooting.
I'm trying to figure out because I had heard that this was all just hot air, that Radfem wasn't even mentioned in the manifesto at all. I haven't looked into it, but I'm not a fan of Radfem Hitler, so part of me was like, ha ha ha. But then another realistic part of me is like, okay, well, you know, someone might mention Blood Satellite in manifesto one day because they didn't like one of our bits. You know, anything could happen.
Sure. And you know what? Blood Satellite's a great. I think I'm even on this cast because Blood Satellite is just a killer title, man. Like, why wouldn't you use it in a manifesto? You know, it's got, you know, for me, words like borrowed from Old Norse, like blood. You got to use them as much as you can. Like the culture's forgotten the impact of simple Nordic words. But.
Yeah, and people like red. It's powerful stuff. Like, we're gonna find our way, and then at that point, you're like, okay, I hope this is a good manifesto because there's some bad manifestos out there, man.
Yeah, dude.
I wonder if that's something that you like. If you're the type of person who ends up in manifesto, like you got like 3 you're mentioned in, there's one you want people to forget about. There was that one manifesto. I'm not trying to get you in trouble from saying the wrong thing here, but if people remember the manifesto of that black guy who is a schizo, and he wrote like 1,000-page manifesto where he said the N-word something like 10,000 times. It was just nonsense. I'm like, if we were in that manifesto, I'd like it, but I don't want to be in the trans manifesto.
You're gonna have to help me out with that one, man. What crime? Like, what was that one?
He was a professor at a school. I forget. We covered it on the show. That was one of the many clips that we got taken down from YouTube because we had the genius idea of just reading it.
That's amazing.
I'm like, I'm not saying it. It's like when you're rapping along with Wu-Tang. I'm just singing it with him.
No, this is literature. I have to, you know, I'm saying what he said.
Yeah, but it's just like nonsense. It's weird and it's gay in parts. It's a schizophrenic rambling thing. But he was a professor at the school, and they just I think he brought a gun to school. No one died, but which is the worst thing. You wrote 1,000-page manifesto and no one got shot. But
he's a modern Ralph Ellison. Like, the culture is just not allowing literature to happen.
Because the whole bit we were doing, and remembering it now, I'm like, this is a good bit. Just reading a full page of just talking about like unicorns flying into an ass, and then you're like, he makes a few good points. They're phrased inelegantly. I'm going to see from his point of view.
We'll do an auto
blaming white people for the moon or something, you know. We got EL here in the chat saying Rat from Hitler is in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, we can only hope. Like, if anyone knows the lore on her, like the real life story of this woman, it's really fucking weird and tragic. Some people think she's playing a character. She is just an insane woman. And to make her into an e-celeb, which she's kind of trying to be recently. She was posting photos of her at the gym. She was doing gym thirst trap images. And she is not hot. And so it's like, this is just an embarrassing thing you're doing. And now she's wanted by the fucking government, by Kamala Harris, I assume. But like, someone made a good point that if you're at all interested in internet subcultures and shit, if you've been paying attention to the shit that's been going on in feminist spaces and the theory that they've been talking about, the things these women are saying are the most outwardly violent, nihilistic, insane screeds. You'd only have heard of them from like the Order of the Nine Angles previously, like that Iron March type stuff. Yeah. But it's just the feminist version of that, and it's got legs.
I believe it, and I was able to take its temperature over time. Obviously, we had Tumblr up until 2017, 2018, where like all kinds of strange Nurgle-style abominations were kind of creeping off of that website. And then that began to be uncomfortably rapidly reflected in academia, informed by queer theory. And then we get constant platforming of people like Bell Hooks, which is concerning. And then there's like this split, right? There's like this turf war, to use the pun. where white women themselves begin to understand that white feminism is a way to like kind of do positional warfare against them, and so there's a kind of white feminist jihad, which I've been interested in. Unfortunately, like white men are still a casualty of white feminism, of the radical variety.
Absolutely true. And, I think a lot of white women, especially white feminists, they're not aware that they're at the intersection of a lot of different battles right now. Like, one thing I pointed out previously is that whenever you see these sort of anti-woman accounts, female L's or, just kind of misogynistic accounts, usually the examples they give are of white women, right? Just being humiliated or owned or whatever. And then you find out later that they're run by like brown guys or black guys. So like, oh, this is a different thing. This is some kind of anti-white thing masquerading as an anti-woman thing. And a lot of them, they're not hip to the fact that they're involved in like a different sort of class conflict. And they think that white feminists are treated differently than any other type of feminist too. I'm like, you're the first ones that get thrown under the bus too. You're
Yeah,
gonna soon, this whole like trans thing is gonna get rolled back, and then they're gonna blame all that on white feminists as well. So I'm like, you're gonna get. We saw what they did with Karens. The whole idea that Karen is in the zeitgeist. I'm like, you're
yeah.
just the ones that get thrown under the bus first, and then you don't know what to do anymore.
I think it's a good read. I mean, there's always the figure of the Karen in whatever period of culture. I forget the Stacey's and things like that in other periods, but I actually think too there's psychosexual dimensions of this where like a bunch of anti-white women stuff is still a way of actually praising and glorifying white women, and it's difficult to work out. And in fact, it's work for poorer souls. I don't want to do it. I don't want to be compromised by it.
Oh, we got a comment here just from Vor. What the fuck is it? Vorp Palinville. Media harps on incels constantly, but there's at least as many morbidly obese blue hairs off the deep end. Well, I guess that's the story of the woman, what we call the femcel shooter, a woman who shot up a school of children. Her story seems to be that she was just kind of a girl loser. They always say like, "Oh, I'm a femcel, I'm a girl incel," but she had a boyfriend too. So it's like, okay,
Yeah,
incel means
exactly.
that you don't have that. You're just a weird bitch then.
See, no, typical woman, right? Like she needs credit for being a femcel, and of course she's got at least like one guy. Like it's just not. It's not real. Even her shooting is this kind of pathetic play for some kind of appraisal. And I don't want to be misogynist about it. Let's be misogynist in the Nietzschean sense that like, okay, women should be a higher type than men or something. And this is kind of sad.
Yeah, we were talking about gun culture, and of course, we ended up on e-girls and what the fuck is wrong with these broads out here. We always end up doing that on this show, but I know we gotta get going right around now. But I want to know if there's just any last thoughts on the legal battles. Are you optimistic about the future? Are you optimistic about Trump? And more importantly, given everything you've been through up to and including the news stories that we just discussed, are you optimistic culturally about the future for this sort of thing?
Oh yeah, in general, very optimistic. There's lots of people doing it, and we predicted lots of people would be doing it. It took 3 or 4 years for that to be true, and you can credit maybe Chinese 3D printers and some other things for helping that happen. But it's not going to stop. There's no meaningful way it would. But I do fear that like there's something like a cold civil war conditions in the United States, where states like California, states like New Jersey, and soon New York, right, because of the shooting, will meaningfully cabin this activity for millions of people and will have an outsized impact on how it works in the rest of the country. Because, of course, in the Southern District of New York and certain cities in California, these prosecutors, these city attorneys, these are very powerful people, man. These are AGs who are now comfortable going outside their, sovereign boundaries, their borders, and they try to reach activity like in Texas, for example, where I am. This is happening to me all the time. I'm being sued by California. I'm being sued by New Jersey. I've seen 2 years of people trying to pass laws in New York about DefCAD. So I'm optimistic in one sense. I know it will not stop. And yet I do see a kind of dark age a little closer than anyone might assume, because no one really takes these legal threats that seriously.
Well, I think that's probably why you got into this to begin with, even politically. You seem to be very attuned to survival and self-preservation. One thing you had mentioned there, and this is my main takeaway from this talk, it's that the opposition to this movement seems to be very top down, by which I mean it's mostly politicians who are against it. Now, when we talk about fentanyl or any other drug, the crack epidemic, you could see politicians against it, but also the people, men and women, families, like they're against this sort of thing. Even something like TikTok, politicians are wary of it. And frankly, most of the people who use TikTok, if you ask them, they'd probably say, yeah, this should be illegal. We shouldn't have this. This is some kind of mind virus, right?
Mm.
However, when it comes to 3D printed guns, I don't detect that the average person either hates them or is terribly afraid of them. It seems to be mostly journalists and politicians. And just to speak to your culture, civil war scenario, I think that, especially with this Luigi Mangione thing, I don't know if the average person, man or woman, fucking liberal or conservative, is really that scared of 3D printed guns. I think some people think it's cool, and more people read the Luigi Mangione story and say, "Wow, 3D printed guns, how cool is that?" Rather than we need to ban this. Does that sound accurate?
I think so. Yeah, that's probably your man on the street take. And I watched this next round of press get generated over Mangione's gun. It looks like, oh, okay, about a week's worth of press on, hey, what do we think about 3D printed guns? There doesn't seem to be a consensus, and of course the gun control groups are yelling about it. Uh, at the same time, there's some proof here that this is a subculture, and it has had time to become mainstream, and has not, and maybe will not. And I think there's reason to think that it will not. That it's kind of the purview of a bunch of fucking nerds and trans people, in fact. And there's reasons to assess maybe why that is.
I guess, and this will be the last question I have for you. Would you like it to be mainstream? Would you like this to be popular, or should it remain the purview of a select segment of the population?
Look, that's hard to say. It's just the culture within a culture, and it's informed by that larger gun culture. And there's a certain kind of snobbishness about it, in fact. So it wants to trot itself out as a fun, accepting hobby, and in some respects it is, but it's not really large enough to service a big hobby base. And then there's a bunch of laws being passed against it specifically, or the things that would allow it to happen. So it's almost like the proof of a kind of decadence and the end of something. And that doesn't mean I'm not optimistic about it becoming more meaningful, and as the technology improves, becoming indispensable. Yet right now it's colonized by people who kind of know it's not serious, and that's just a fact.
I do wonder what this looks like, as morbid as this sounds, once the boomers pass away. How much of this is affected by, like you said, that sort of Cold War mentality, and all it would take is maybe a new generation of people who are more, into this sort of thing, where most of this goes away, or at least gets accepted. Do you think that could be it at all, or is it deeper than that?
Well, look, even people within the present culture kind of forget what it was like at the beginning. When I started this thing and was like, hey, I'm going to 3D print a gun, even the American gun culture and the boomer, as you mentioned, were like, that's some fucking bullshit, dude. No one's going to 3D print a gun. Also, get away from us. 3D printed guns have nothing to do with what we're doing here. This is a distraction. The gun culture itself refused 3D printed guns. And in 10 or 15 years, okay, now there's like this common cause. People forget that. And so even I'm probably wrong, but maybe 10 or 15 years from now, there will be congressmen being like 3D printed guns are an American birthright. There probably even been statements like that. So you may be right. And yet that almost maps with what the Second Amendment has been in American political culture, and like the American Whig political culture, for example. No one ever really meant what they were talking about with the Second Amendment 200 years ago. And now it's accidentally true.
That's a great way to end, I think, actually. I know you gotta get going. Very busy. I really, really enjoyed this talk. This is everything I hoped it would be. We've been trying for so long to set this up. I know a lot of our listeners were really thrilled that this is happening. So I just want to thank you again. I've been just going through the sites as you've been talking as well, showing off some of the wares and what people can expect. So if you're just listening to the audio version of this, you don't get to enjoy that. If you're looking at this, if you're watching on X, on YouTube, you've got a pretty good view. I'm seeing a lot of reasonable guns. I'm seeing some really preposterous looking things that are just there for me. That's my type of gun. I like the Red Bull can suppressor. I love that shit. So is there anything else that we got your sites up here? Is there anything else that you would like to call attention to or plug that I might have missed?
I feel bad about it, man. The more you plug some of my stuff, the more likely this video will be taken down. So I think we've done a good job. You've probably done too much already, and know that this is what the Thousand Flowers Blooming looks like. I mean, not all these ideas deserve to survive, and yet here they are, and it's our job there at DefCat to preserve as much of it as possible, because even standard link rot on the web is something like 10% a year, or really kind of alarming. But especially with 3D printed guns, the creators disappear, the sites go down, the files are purged off of other standard repos. So really, there's this kind of I don't know. We're building a Pokédex, but we're also just trying to rescue these things before they disappear.
Yeah, and if I could suggest people who maybe have just heard about this, it's a very rich and vibrant community. There's people who have 3D printed gun. They all kinds of crazy designs. There's creative teams working on this. They have their own shooting competitions. There's communities that have a lot of history there that you can look into. It's not this big scary thing that you've been taught to listen. You've heard fucking Cody talk this entire time. Does he sound like a fucking grug brain psycho? No, he sounds like a champion of the Second Amendment. And I think that even in Canada, there's a lot of people who could be interested in stuff like this. And I hope more people look into the Coast Runner device, which is just like, to me, again, just as an outsider, it's just like a cool, solid machine. And I get excited about this anytime I hear about decentralized manufacturing on a smaller scale. That, just as a side story, is very energizing to me.
Well, thank you, man. Thank you for the platform and for your time. And I've been excited about what you guys are doing too. I should have been more complimentary, but
don't worry about it.
If I can be of service, I will. Coast Runner is for sale in Canada.
Oh, excellent. Here we go. Yeah, I got the site up right here. Go coastrunner.net is where you guys want to be going to watch the trailer. Like you said, yeah, go look at the site. You get all the information there. And I'll let you go. Once again, thank you for your time. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. And I'll see you next time.